Welcome to the SWIKE podcast, the only podcast that shares the stuff you didn't know you needed to know about jobs, careers, and life. The SWIKE podcast, the stuff I wish I knew earlier.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the SWIKE Stuff I Wish I Knew Earlier, the podcast. We're back with another Youth Corner with Kelly Yang. And today's topic, I think we were getting into finding internships. So for a lot of folks, they're going to school to learn and get a degree and all that sort of stuff. But work experience is becoming more and more important for those that graduate. Some schools have co-op where it's actually integrated into the work or into the study periods, but some of them don't, and folks are kind of left on their own to find their own internships and some career centers obviously provide some help. So on my side, I took a co-op program, so I was the lucky part where it was integrated, but for other folks it's not, right? So when you kind of walk through your experience, and then I'll color it back with my experience on the co-op side, and we'll kind of talk about like the differences between the two.
Yeah, so my program does not have a co-op program, but there is a strong emphasis on trying to find your own internships during the summer months if you're not taking additional courses. And even though we don't have a formal co-op program, we have a pretty good career center that helps us with postings. They host events. They try to bring in some employers so you can network and try to find what company or what role that you might be interested in. But usually this kicks in around second year and above. In first year, you're really on your own. And for me, I really wanted to get some work experience. But I think the biggest factor was that my parents wanted me to move back home for the summer, and I wanted to stay in Toronto. And the only leverage I would have for staying in Toronto was if I had an internship. So that was my main driver of trying to find an internship in my first year.
Gotcha. And for those that know Kelly's story, she kind of joined business almost on a whim, right? She didn't really have that experience. So in first year, were kind of figuring out like what area of business. So what was kind of that journey like? And then did you, when you were applying to that first internship, did you kind of apply to pretty much anything and everything, or did you have a few set of companies and roles that you were looking into, or like what would be useful for folks to start thinking about as they're getting into their first years or applying for their first internships?
Yeah. So I would say in first year, it's fairly difficult to get an internship at an established company because they're generally hiring second year, third year, or students that have a little bit of experience. So what I did is I try to target startups because they're a little bit more flexible in who they hire. So I applied off of Indeed, actually, which is a job board that has a lot of local jobs. And one stuck. I did an interview with them. It was a fairly good fit. So then I decided to do my internship with, it was actually I think like a mechanical engineering company, but they were looking for someone to do some of their business and finance stuff. So that's where I fit in.
And when you were applying to jobs, like how many did you do? Because I know some folks aren't really prepared for like sometimes the volume that needs to happen. Because I've heard from folks that they've applied to, I applied to 10 jobs and I'm not getting a response. I'm like, well, you probably need to apply more than that. My typical benchmark is you can probably expect an interview between like 20 and 40 applications, right? And that's just kind of a first stage interview. If you want to actually move on and actually get an offer, it might be like 100 or 200 applications. So I don't know what your experience has been, and I find that in the kind of entry level, it's even more competitive because like everybody's kind of vying for that. Everybody in your program and the other school programs and whatever. And then obviously there's the whole networking side, which like we'll touch on a little bit later. But like what were kind of your numbers, your metrics, or like how did you go about applying to all of these different jobs?
So I think for me, actually, my first year, I think I applied to maybe 3 to 5.
Oh, geez.
It
Okay,
was
so you're
really,
one of the lucky ones.
I think I got very lucky. My startup job, I think, was just hidden very well. So the applicant pool was fairly small.
Mm.
And I think the other companies were in a rush to hire as well. So out of the 5, I interviewed at 3. And then I got offers from 3, but I chose to do the startup one. But in my second year, I think I applied to much more. I applied to at least 50, and I had a spreadsheet to track everything because the numbers were so large.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's actually a pretty interesting technique or strategy maybe to find kind of those jobs where if you're like a big bank or a telecom or a retailer or whatever, you have kind of the brand recognition where people want to work for you. Whereas if you're like ABC company or whatever, where you're like a 10-person firm or a 50-person firm or something and nobody's ever heard of you, well, you're going to be more challenged to attract kind of like top talent and that sort of thing. So yeah, that could be an interesting strategy for folks to target a lot of the startups or the smaller companies. But yeah, there is something to be said about having a large company on your resume, because that means that you went through this whole competitive, like hundreds of resumes going through in that. Because I know I used to run the undergrad campus recruiting program at Deloitte, and we would get a whole bunch of students applying, and yeah, having to go through like, I think for any particular term, we had like 800-900 students applying, and we would have to filter. I think for co-ops, we would hire maybe like 10 in our group. So like 1,000 to 10 is kind of like the numbers we have to get to. So it was a pretty challenging process. So for folks that are going through that, at least from the recruiter side, you got to make sure that your resume is neat and tidy, right? Absolutely no spelling mistakes. Like a single spelling mistake could spell the end of your entire application. Like even consistent formatting, right? Because what we're trying to do on the recruiter side is finding any reason to say no, right? Because if I have like 900 of these things to go through, any little reason to say no, even if it's a whatever, a false positive or a positive negative, whatever that is. But if even though you're the best candidate, but if that's the quality that's on your resume, then you might be thrown out. So just be very diligent about that. And then at the end of the day, it becomes content, right? Like, can I believe that you can do the work, right? And sometimes it's like the transferable skills, any extracurriculars or coursework or whatever you can. And I think when we chatted, you had some previous experience, even though it wasn't like in the business. Like, you feel that working like previous jobs kind of helped you in securing some of your previous work, or what were some of the different things that you did before that might have helped?
Yeah, so I think one thing I was told in first year is to not include high school
Okay.
activities if I could help it. So I tried to fill my resume up with actually extracurriculars, and I didn't have any job experience on it. But with my extracurriculars, I really focused on highlighting my impact. So I made my role seem, so I helped show the recruiter what I did in my role. For example, I'd say, oh, I helped increase engagement by 50%, instead of just describing what I did. And I think for that, it helps the recruiter to see like what you're capable of, like you were saying.
Yeah. And a lot of the recommendations that I give are in that regard, where a lot of folks say, well, they tell them the activities they did versus their achievements, right? So an activity is what you did. So like you managed a team of 5 people, right? But an achievement is I coached 5 people to be top performing salespeople in their respective regions by the end of the year, right?
Right.
Because the counter to that could be I led a team of 5 people and then they all quit by the end of the month because I micromanaged them to death, right? But I still manage that team, right? So a lot of folks are too busy writing down what they did versus how well they did it and their impact. So definitely a good word of wisdom. So it sounds like from a work perspective, you went the approach of starting with kind of the small startups and different companies, and then you moved to the bigger companies. So what was that transition, or what was that process like? Did you kind of feel a difference between kind of going from the small companies to the big companies, or were they pretty much the same?
Oh, it was so different. So I'll start from the recruiting process. With the startup, everything was very laid back. It was like very personal. I was emailing back and forth directly with the people on the team. And at the interview, I was actually interviewed by people on the team. But when I moved on to the big company, my first was at CIBC, I went through the HR department rather than the team that was hiring me. So everything felt a bit more like disconnected, and I didn't really know who the team was going to be until I got to a certain stage in the interview process. And then on the team, everything was very bureaucratic. And I think the pace was generally a lot slower than it was at my startup. At my startup, I could really tackle anything I wanted to. If there was a problem, I could just solve it within the day. But when I was at a big company, you had to go through layers and layers of compliance and regulation, meetings and emails before things could get done. So at times it was a bit frustrating. But I was lucky I had a really great team and they coached me through it all. They taught me how to attend meetings, take notes, send appropriate emails, how to rush people in a polite way if you needed to. So I definitely learned a lot, even though it was a very different experience.
So if you were to recommend to folks, because some people are of the mindset, well, I want to work for a big giant company, right? So business, if you're in accounting, it's always one of the big four, even though there's like hundreds, if not thousands of accounting companies out there, right? And that's just kind of with any industry, there's always like, if you're in the tech side, I want to work for like Google, Microsoft, and all of those big players, but there's so many smaller tech companies. Like if you had kind of words of guidance for like small versus big companies, like would you have a couple of things that you'd want folks to think about when they make the decision between the two?
Yeah, I think maybe try to see what your personality is like. If you're very impatient, a big company might not be the best for you. But there are perks to big companies. You have bigger teams, you can create bigger impact. You have more resources at your disposal as well. But I think at the end of the day, the most important thing is like personality fit. So you don't want to be forcing yourself to work at a startup where you have to do everything if that's not your personality. But at the same time, if you hate going through roadblocks and bureaucracy, then you won't enjoy your time at a big firm.
Yeah, and every firm is a little bit different where sometimes they have a lot of that bureaucracy and sometimes they are smaller and nimbler and sometimes it's really not the company, sometimes it's the group itself, right? It's the leader that's in charge that kind of dictates like, hey, yeah, go ahead, do it whenever you want, or versus like you got to tell me like every minute by minute what you're doing, the micromanaging type doing there. So when you were going through the process, what do you think helped you stand out? Because that's always a question that I get as a recruiter, like, how do I stand out? From your perspective, what are some of the things that you think helped you stand out?
For me, I really wanted to get this opportunity because I was being told that in order to get into investment banking, which was one of my goals, I had to land a job at a bank. So I spent a lot of time doing research on the company and the group prior to my interviews so that I would be able to talk to the group and to what they did if any questions arose. And I think that helped me stand out a little bit because I've heard some stories where recruiters ask, "Oh, what do you think we do?" And the answer is like completely unrelated to what they do. Um,
And what was some of the research that you did? So was it literally just going on their website and reading like about that group, or did you like have coffee chats with folks, or like attend events, or what are some of the parts of that research that might help other people stand out, right? And I guess one challenge is always that the it's almost like an arms race where like people are standing out, and every year people do the same things, and then they need to do different things to stand out, and it gets harder and harder and harder. But if you're okay to share some of your tips and tricks, what would be some of the things that you would recommend for folks to do to stand out?
yeah. Networking is very useful. In first year and second year, I didn't really particularly enjoy networking because it made me very nervous. So I kind of tried to stay away from it. But in third year, I had no choice because for my industry, you like have to network in order to get the interview. So instead, what I did for to prep for my interviews, I just researched a lot online. So I would go to the company's website, read about the company, know their mission and vision and value statements. But then I would also look at the group and try to find out who was actually in the group. Maybe stalk them a little bit on LinkedIn, see where their career path was. And then if it was possible, I would try to weave that into the conversation at the interview and say, "Oh, I noticed that you started out doing this, but then moved to CIBC. I'm just really curious why." And then try to piggyback on something they said. Because you can do a lot of research, but you also have to show them that you did the research. So it's just trying strategically to weave things in.
And speaking of interviews, like what was the interview process? So maybe at you mentioned a little bit the startup where it's pretty casual and you kind of interviewing with the group, but maybe with the more formal or more intimidating processes out there, what might folks have to look forward to or not look forward to in that whole process?
Yeah, for sure. So I think it kind of depends on the industry. In business, it's usually behavioral interviews. These are questions like, oh, what would you do in this situation? Or tell me about a time when you face a problem, things like that. So it's pretty straightforward. You just have to be confident, have a few like scenarios ready to talk about, and be yourself, and try to be personable. But then as some of the positions get more challenging, you might also be asked to complete various testing. So you might have to play like games online or complete like a literacy or a math based test as well. And I believe in like some computer science and engineering jobs, they'll also ask you to do some coding at the interview. So you have to be prepared for that. And for certain specified industries like consulting and investment banking, there'll also be technical components where you'll have to solve a case, or answer technical questions during your interview as well.
Cool. And what, if any of that, did the either career center or like a student club or like anything from like uh, anything on school helped you with that, or is this really just like a individual activity where you did everything on your own?
Oh, it would be nearly impossible to do everything on your own, I think. For me, I really had to brush up on my technical skills because they weren't very strong at all. But our career center provided these courses led by Marquis. Um, I think they're a group, they do like consulting and banking courses.
Mhm.
So they teach you a lot of valuation skills and how to actually approach the questions that are asked in interviews. So I started there, I took some of their courses, and that really helped me. And then I just reached out to my friends in student groups, in finance groups and investment groups, who kind of knew what the process of investment banking recruiting was. And they pointed me in the direction of various guidebooks, and various textbooks that I could read to further my understanding.
Yeah, so it sounds like there's a lot of preparation that needs to go into like the application process and and the interview process in general as well.
Mhm.
And one of the things I often recommend to folks is that interviewing is a skill, right? It needs to be practiced, right? Most people say, I'll just go in and wing it, right? It's like, well, that's probably the worst thing you can do because oftentimes it's you need to understand like how to answer the question. Like for a case interview, there's a certain way that you want to go about like analyzing the problem, and to learn that right off the spot is super hard. Same with behavioral questions where you might use a framework, like they have like the star, the
Yeah.
car, the chair, or whatever. And if you don't know that sort of stuff, and a lot of interviewers are trained to watch out for that. So if you're not saying it that way, it's just so hard to be kind of clear and concise as well. And yeah, with technical, I mean, that's what school is for, right? Hopefully you're getting that technical knowledge. But some of the technologies or processes or whatever, there's no course on that, right? So you have to go out of your way with, I guess, these specialized courses or other areas in order to make yourself suitable for a particular role or whatever. So yeah, so it looks like we gave a lot of good guidance where from an internship, well, start early. Sounds like as much as you can apply, and you can take a strategy of applying for the small one. So don't just always go after the big guys and their formal processes, because it's much more competitive in that vein. And in that competition, like make sure you're aware of what you need to do, like the mission, how to answer questions and things like that. Leverage your career center and all that sort of stuff. And friends, seniors and upper years, I think are good people to reach out to as well. And at the end of the day, like practice and allocate the time to do all that, because it's so important. And I think you touched a little bit on the networking component, which yeah, is challenging for many, especially the more shy, the more introverted folks out there. But it's something that, again, it's a skill, just like interviewing. You can get better if you decide to put in some of the effort. So are there anything else that you'd want to share, and other words of wisdom that you'd want to have for folks in regards to kind of the internship process, or kind of landing your first or maybe your next job or opportunity?
I think one thing I'll highlight is the importance of mock interviews.
Mm.
Luki kind of touched on this, but sometimes they're overlooked. And if you do like maybe 2 or 3 mock interviews before your real interview, it'll make your progress, and how coherent you sound so much better. So it's definitely worth it. Try to find maybe someone who has been in that role before and just ask them for maybe 10, 15 minutes of their time.
Yeah, and if you can't do that, then use your smartphone, record yourself,
Yeah.
and one a day is what I often recommend, right? At least to start. If you can get up to 8 or more, then it's even better. But just one a day, because if you, let's say, start with the "tell me about yourself" question, probably the most common question that you're asked, and do it until the end of the month, the end of the year, right? By the time your 4 years are up, that's like thousands of times you practice. And I don't know many people who have done things like 1,000 times and haven't got good at it, right? So,
Yeah.
and practicing, it'll only take like 5 minutes a day, right? For one question, right? And if you can improve, then that'll set you on your way. So, but it kind of goes back to, I think we talked about last time, the procrastination and the studying, where sometimes people wait till the last minute on, oh, I have an interview tomorrow, let me go cram. Whereas if you started preparing proactively right now for the interview you might have next week, next month, next year, then it'll go so much more smoothly. But yeah, I think that's a lot of great advice for folks that are looking for their internships. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Thanks for joining us on the SWIKE Stuff I Wish I Knew Earlier, the podcast. If you like the podcast, please subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you found this podcast. And if you can give us a review, that would be very appreciated. Feel free to contact me on LinkedIn at Luki Danu, LUKIDANU, and the same on most social media platforms. And I look forward to hearing from you. Thanks. Bye.